Good morning, everyone.
Recording in progress.
Okay, everyone's been recorded, you know that. Okay, welcome to today's news briefing on the redistricting battle in Harris County, Texas. How boundaries get drawn determines whether a community's voice gets heard. I'm Pilar Barrero, Associate Editor of Ethnic Media Services and your moderator for today. A special thanks to our co-host, Houston in Action, to Mi Familia Vota, and the Texas Civil Rights Project for their help in planning today's event. Our speakers will explore what redistricting is, why it has traditionally discriminated against communities of color and low-income neighborhoods, and what activists are doing now to make the process more fair. We ask that you enter your questions in the chat box and that speakers and stakeholders share responses in the chat box if they can, in case we don't get to everyone. We have great speakers and too little time. We also ask the speakers speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. If you speak too fast, I will interrupt you and ask you to slow down. We will send everyone a recording of today's event, plus a detailed who is who of our speakers and related collateral. Now, let me introduce our first speaker, Mirtala Tristan, a resident of the suburb of Lakewood, which is a long distance from Houston's City Hall. She will talk about what it means when your neighborhood has still not yet recovered from massive floods and hurricanes because you have no political clout. She will speak in Spanish and pause for me to interpret to English. So be patient with us. Mirtala, bienvenida, buenos días, muchas gracias por estar aquí, por contarnos tu historia. Adelante, por favor, y haz pausas para que yo pueda traducir.
Ok, buenos días. Primeramente quiero darles las gracias por la invitación que hicieron para contar yo mi historia.
First of all, good morning. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to tell my story.
Mi nombre es Mirtala Tristán. Estoy viviendo por 35 años en el barrio de Lakewood.
My name is Mirtala Tristan. I've lived in the Lakewood neighborhood for 35 years.
Soy parte de CIR y también del Noroeste Acción Colectivo como voluntaria.
Mirtala, ¿qué es CIR?
Ok. Que soy parte del grupo CIR y también del Noroeste Acción Colectivo.
Sí, te entendí, pero que no sé qué lo que es. No sé lo que es CIR. ¿Qué es CIR?
Es un grupo que también se formó después del huracán Harvey. Y ellos nos han ayudado a nosotros,
Okay.
Noroeste Acción Colectivo.
Okay. She's part of a coalition that was formed after the hurricane, CIR, and also part of the Northeast Action Collective.
Pues yo les voy a contar una parte de mi historia del huracán Harvey.
She's going to tell part of her story about what happened during Hurricane Harvey.
Que ha sido muy terrible para mí y cada que yo lo voy a expresar o voy a contar mi historia, creo que lo vuelvo a vivir.
It was terrible for me. And every time that I recount the story, I feel like I'm living it again.
Cuando nos están avisando en las noticias que nos va a llegar el huracán Harvey.
When they tell us in the news that Harvey was coming,
nosotros estamos atentos a las noticias, qué es lo que va a estar pasando.
We were watching the news to see what, to be aware of what was going to happen.
En ningún momento teníamos que evacuar porque iba a ser algo terrible.
They never told us that we would have to evacuate because it was going to be so terrible.
Cuando empieza a llover, terriblemente, yo miro que el agua nunca para, empieza a llover y llover y llover.
When it started raining, I was watching and I noticed that it never stopped. It was just raining, raining, raining.
Cuando yo abro mi puerta para ver la calle, yo miro que ya el agua va corriendo como un río.
When I opened my door to the street, I noticed there's a river of water running out on my street.
Yo empiezo a levantar unas cosas para poder salvar y no perder todo.
I started to try to pick up things to be able to save them and not lose everything.
Me dio un poco de tiempo, después del mediodía empezó a entrar el agua por todos los lugares de mi casa.
A little bit of time later, about noon, the water started coming in from every place inside my home.
Estuvimos toda la tarde y toda la noche. Yo empecé a hablarle al 311 y nunca nos contestaron por 5 horas.
The whole afternoon and evening, I was calling the 311 line, emergency line, and for 5 hours, they never picked up.
Solamente mi esposo y yo vivimos en esta casa. Toda la noche pasamos en vela, esperando qué era lo que iba a seguir pasando.
My husband and I were alone in the house, and we were awake all night, just awaiting whatever would happen.
Como eso de las 5 de la mañana, yo escuchaba las sirenas, los helicópteros y mucho ruido que empecé a entrar en pánico.
About 5 in the morning, I started hearing the sirens and the alarms, and I started to panic.
Le dije a mi esposo, tenemos que irnos de aquí de nuestra casa, y él no quería.
I told my husband we had to leave, and he didn't want to.
Agarramos nuestras pertenencias como la licencia, un poco de dinero, lo pusimos en una Ziploc baggie y salimos a pedir ayuda.
Finally, we got our license, a little bit of money in a Ziploc bag, and we just took off.
Cuando salimos a la calle aquí principal, que es la Richland, donde nosotros vivimos, ya la calle parecía como un arroyo, un río, no sé ni qué decirles, con aguas sucias, feas, donde la corriente nos regresaba para atrás.
When we went out on the street where we live, the street was a river, but the water was nasty, it was dirty, and it pushed back against us, keeping us from moving forward.
Cuando empezamos a caminar como media cuadra, yo escuché un ruido de un bote que venía a auxiliar personas.
About half block, I heard a noise of a boat that came to help.
Yo le levanté la mano y le pedí auxilio.
I raised my hand and asked for help.
Yo recuerdo que esa persona era un americano y me dijo a mí, sigan adelante caminando porque yo voy a auxiliar a unas personas de la tercera edad que ellos no pueden llegar aquí.
It was an American guy, a white guy, and he said, I can't help you right now because I'm looking for some elderly people that I need to be helping, so keep going.
Cuando llegamos a la calle Mesa, que fue la principal, ya había demasiada gente ahí. También empezamos a platicar y dijeron que estaban en las mismas condiciones que nosotros.
When we arrived to Mesa Street, there were lots of people there, and we started talking to them, and they were all in the same condition as us.
Cuando regresa el bote, nos empieza a cruzar a una escuela que se llama Barnett. Simplemente nos cruza la calle Mesa.
When the boat arrives, they simply helped us cross the street Mesa to a school. That's all they did.
Solamente tuvimos como 1 hora y media y yo empezaba a oír en esa escuela Barnett que todo el mundo gritaba porque todo el mundo quería ser salvo, se querían salvar.
And all I could hear in that school were screams, people screaming about wanting to be saved, be helped.
Nos empezaron a subir a un trailer de 18 ruedas, todas las personas que pudiéramos caber.
They put us in a big trailer, in a big truck, 18-wheeler, and they just put everyone that they could in the back.
Lo más triste que me da y que yo me siento así es por la razón de que yo pienso que lo estamos viviendo de nuevo. No es justo que nos subían a esos trailers cuando el trailer le daba un poco a manejar. Muchas personas de la tercera edad, niños, todos caían a esos ríos, a esas aguas tan sucias y costrosas.
So when the truck started moving, we were packed in the back, and people started falling off the truck. Even older people, kids, they were falling on these dirty waters.
Nos trajeron navegando todo el día hasta llegar a un lugar donde se presentan artistas. que se llama el George R. Brown. Desde la mañana hasta como las 6 o 7 de la tarde pudimos llegar ahí.
So from the morning till 7 p.m., finally we arrived to this big stadium where they were offering help.
Todo el día anduvimos navegando, sin comer, sin nada, todos remojados. Parecíamos unas personas que yo pienso que no tenemos derecho a estar pasando por todo esto. Yo pienso que el gobierno debe de ponerse a trabajar.
We were all day navigating those dirty waters, and they didn't give us water. They didn't give us food. We were wet. I think this is very unfair, and that the government should be helping us in a different way. But this is very unfair.
Pasamos ese huracán y todavía estábamos haciendo aplicaciones para que tuviéramos algunas ayudas. Siempre nos dijeron, están en espera, y nunca llegó nada.
We passed the hurricane and we started filing for help and trying to get help from the government, and they told us it's coming, and we never got anything.
Esa es la razón por la que yo estoy aquí con estos grupos, porque yo quiero que nuestras voces sean escuchadas. Y que
This is the reason why. This is the reason why I'm working with these groups.
Y que todos juntos podamos llegar a lograrlo. Y yo les pido y les digo a todos los gobernantes que se pongan a trabajar.
This is the reason why I work with these activist groups, that we want all the different governments to start working for the people, because this is the way it should be. Mirtala, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias por tu testimonio. Sabemos que es difícil. We know it's very difficult to do this because she lives it again. We had another conversation on the phone the other day, and it was like this. No, al contrario. Es normal que te sientas así. It's very nice. Yeah. Go ahead.
Ya quedé enferma mentalmente porque solamente cuando empieza a llover entro en pánico y me entra mucho miedo y coraje. Gracias.
Gracias a ti. She says that she's still traumatized and that whenever it rains, she feels panicked and she feels like she's going to leave it all over again. Okay. Muchas gracias, Mirtala. Thanks to Mirtala for sharing with us. Everyone is thanking her on the chat. And this is what happens when a community is invisible to the powers that be. I'm going to move on. I don't know if anyone has a question for Mirtala. Maybe you can save it for later. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Nina Perales. She's a longtime litigator for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, who says redistricting has defined her work in life. Mrs. Perales, please help us understand how redistricting works and why it discriminates against communities like Mrs. Tristan's. Nina, welcome.
Thank you very much for the welcome, and gracias, Mirtala, for sharing your story. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me to present on this call, and thank you, Pilar, for the introduction. Pilar knows that my daughter is named Pilar, so I have always felt a special connection to you, Pilar Marrero. I would like to share my slides right now, which I have only a few of because it's helpful for me to be able to share some images. And it looks like I can do it. So I'm super excited to do this with you. Let me just move my screen a little bit so that I can get this to be the right size. Yeah. And then I'm going to present. I can move this box right here. There we go. All right.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you about what is redistricting. And this is a map you'll recognize of Harris County. This is just an example. I'm not going to talk about this map, but this is just an example of a redistricting map. And in its most basic form, redistricting is just about drawing lines on a map to represent who is going to vote for certain elected officials. And neighborhoods are grouped together into these types of districts, essentially to create groups of voters, I guess is the best way to put it, right? And how these lines go on the map is a very political act. It's a very political process, and one that's very important to get involved in. So I always like to start with the idea that we live in communities. I'm sitting in Houston right now. This is a few blocks from my house. And this is a type of community that we might live in if we have a place to live in Harris County. There are other types of examples of communities that we live in. Some of us live in suburbs. Some of us live in the city. Some of us live in some of the outer areas like Myrtala does outside of the city. And all of these areas, all of these neighborhoods are grouped together into districts. And from time to time, those district boundaries are redrawn. And we're going into a process right now following the census where the district boundaries are redrawn. I'm going to give you an example from Pasadena, Texas, which is right outside of Houston. This is a picture of Pasadena. Some people think it's a very pretty city. Some people say it's not so pretty, but it is the home of many, many people. Pasadena is also a very racially segregated city. This is a map showing the concentration of Latino population in Pasadena. The areas that are pale yellow are Anglo concentrations of population. And the more it goes from orange to red is the concentration of Latinos in Pasadena. And so you will see that there's a very stark pattern of segregation in Pasadena, with Latinos living primarily in a neighborhood called the North Side of Pasadena. So what I want to talk to you about today is about the North Side of Pasadena, where so many Mexican Americans live and where so many vote. The North Side of Pasadena has historically received fewer services than the South Side of Pasadena. Anglos have controlled Pasadena government for many, many, many years. And this is an example of what would happen in the North Side when it would rain. You would get flooding because there was not good flood control in the North, although there was very good flood control in the South. So Pasadena, and I'm going to use my cursor here, the North Side of Pasadena was split in the drawing of political lines for the Texas House of Representatives. So I'm not even going to talk to you about what was going on with the political lines inside Pasadena. Just assume with me that the North Side of Pasadena was represented to some degree in city government, but what was happening with the state government was a different story. In the state government, the Texas House of Representatives boundaries split the area of North Side Pasadena so that somewhere in one district, sorry, they're here, somewhere in one district and somewhere in another. And a lot of Latino voters in Pasadena were down in this district here, which was much more white and much more suburban. So here's the North Side of Pasadena, and here you have a line that was splitting that neighborhood for the purpose of politics. After the 2010 census was taken and we had litigation, the North Side of Pasadena was subsequently all included in one district called District 144. So the lines were redrawn as a result of going to court and saying that the North Side of Pasadena ought to be kept together when these political lines were drawn. And there was a very direct result of that happening. The representative for that district, who was Anglo and conservative, lost his election, and he was replaced by a progressive Latina woman in the House of Representatives. The context for all of this is that the Latino community is increasing in its registration and voting. We are also increasing in our numbers. This is the change in Texas overall. You can see that in the last census, not this most recent one, but in the last census, statewide, Anglos grew by less than 500,000. Latinos grew by almost 2.8 million. But our growth and our increased political participation is strongest when the political lines that are drawn around our neighborhoods are fair. And so redistricting is a time when we need to be very involved and very vigilant about what's going on so that we can ensure that our growth and our registration and our coming out to vote are fairly reflected in political lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Can you refer, or can you compare the situations in this context of redistricting and districts of Latinos to that of, for example, AAPI populations?
Yes, AAPI populations are growing at an even faster rate than the Latino population in Texas. The numbers are a little bit different. The AAPI population is smaller numerically, but growing faster in terms of the speed. That is partly due to immigration, but importantly also due to people simply, making families, having kids. And so there are two really important sources of growth that the Latino community and the Asian American population share together, which is a combination of immigration and natural family growth that is driving our increase. And also what this translates to is that as people are moving around, shifting neighborhoods, having larger families, arriving from other countries and becoming naturalized citizens and voters, is that we have to look at the political lines as we begin to redraw and say to ourselves, how can these political boundaries be most fair given what our neighborhoods look like today?
We have a question from Peter White. Can you comment about the actual process? Who controls, who draws the line? Here in Tennessee, we also have a trifecta and the legislature control the process. And here in California, of course, we used to have the legislature control the process, and now it's an elected commission. It's a redistricting commission, sorry.
So who controls the process of redrawing political lines depends on which political lines we're talking about. So for example, in a city, if you have elections by district, it's going to be the city council that's going to control the redrawing of those lines. You will, if you live in Texas, live in a school district. The school board of trustees is responsible for redrawing those lines in the school district if you have a districted school district. Everybody in Texas lives in a county. Most counties are divided into 4 political districts. It's the county commissioners who redraw those political district lines. And then finally, at the state level, the people who are responsible for redrawing the political boundaries for State House of Representatives, State Senate, congressional seats, and State Board of Education is the Texas legislature. And that was the reference to the trifecta. That means that the Texas legislature has a majority of Republicans in the House and the Senate and a Republican governor, which means we have what's called one-party control of how our state boundaries are drawn. The reason that I mentioned them last, however, is that local redistricting is something not to pass up. It's really important to engage in local redistricting, city, school board, county, because the decisions that are made by our local elected officials can be tremendously important to the quality of life that we have in our community. It can make the difference between school to prison pipeline policies within our school district. It can make the difference with a city getting a park on the minority side of town, so people can walk in the evenings after dinner and get a little bit of exercise, or the kids have somewhere to play. So I want to emphasize how important it is. You'll hear a lot of talk about state level redistricting, about hearings in Austin, about going and testifying. Yes, tremendously important, but don't pass up an opportunity to participate in local redistricting as well.
Nina, we need to move to our next speaker, but I want to ask a combination of a couple of questions that are in the chat so we can close this part. So Ani Advincula says, please explain how this dilutes or mutes the voice of, for example, immigrants and ethnic communities. And what role should those immigrant communities play in their districts or areas? I mean, what's the message for them?
So immigrant communities are made up of naturalized citizens and people who have not yet naturalized. So for example, my husband is immigrant. He's also a naturalized citizen and a voter. So I'm not sure if the question has to do with citizenship or whether it has to do with whether or not you're an immigrant. But in the Latino community, in the AAPI community, you're going to have neighborhoods with people of many different statuses. Everybody can participate in the redistricting process. Everybody can go to a hearing and talk about their neighborhood and the importance of making sure that their neighborhood is respected when political boundaries are drawn. And that might mean hold our neighborhood whole. It could mean that. It might mean, you know what, our neighborhood is big enough, we want to be in 2 districts. We want to have a voice in 2. So it really depends. But certainly everybody can participate in the redistricting process, whether or not you are an actual voter in this moment.
Thank you so much, Nina Perales. Thank you for your explanation. Now we go to 4 activists who will describe their efforts to make the redistricting process in Harris County more fair. Each will have 6 minutes to speak, and we will reserve Q&A until all of them have spoken. So the first one is Debbie Chan, works with OCA Houston, and will share how Asian American Pacific Islander communities fought back against redistricting maps that diluted their collective voice. Ms. Chen, welcome.
Thank you for having me. And just to follow from what Nina was speaking about, it goes directly to the heart, where you do not have to be a citizen or a registered voter in order to participate in redistricting, right? So last year, OCA Greater Houston, along with other community organizations, we focused very much every 10 years on the census. This immediate past census is the 3rd census that I've been working on, of just me personally with OCA Greater Houston. And the reason is because we wanted to make sure everybody got counted, right? So we went and dropped, 221,000 doors, and regardless of whether or not they were, Asian or African-American or Latino, whoever, we just wanted everyone to get counted because we were focusing on immigrant communities in apartment complexes, which are oftentimes forgotten or, just really just invisible, right? Because they're considered, poor, they don't participate as much. And these are all these types of negative stereotypes. So I want to emphasize that, we did that because we wanted to make sure everyone got counted so that everyone is included when we are talking about redistricting, right? So when you filled out the census, it did not matter whether or not you were a citizen or a non-citizen. You existed as a living human being, you needed to get counted. And the same thing applies to redistricting, right? Everyone who is a living human being, gets counted for when these districts are formed. And I echo Nina, that you want to, be involved, not just at the state or congressional level, but to pay attention to the local level, because that's where it's going to really impact everyone immediately, right? City council, county commissioners, these are all people who are working with budgets of money, tax money that we all paid, right? Both locally as well as what gets distributed back down because of the census numbers. Everyone who got counted, that meant your neighborhood in the greater Houston area gets $15,700 of federal money. And that money is all of our tax money. So, the importance, I stress the census because it comes every 10 years and people forget about it. But really, census and redistricting, they go hand in hand. It ultimately comes down to not just about electoral power, it's about who gets the money that we all paid into and who gets to determine how that money gets spent, right?
Debbie, remember to speak slowly for the interpreters. Thank you.
Sorry. So when we're talking about who gets to spend the money that gets distributed down, then it really does come down to, are these districts, are they going to be fair and equitable? Are they fair, opportunity maps is the terms I like to use, where, if you look at the map that, Nina showed, if the district is majority one, group, and there's a minority of other groups, then do we really think that those groups who live in the minority, are their needs going to be taken care of? And we can see this across just Houston, right? There are certain areas where there are no potholes. There are always streetlights that are on. There are sidewalks. And then there are, areas of this city that don't have that. We have open sewage, lines next, we call them ditches, but really they're open sewers, right? No piping. Why is that happening in certain areas versus another? It all comes back to, how is our money allocated and who is making the decision on how that money gets spent? And so I'll just point to an example, since someone had, asked about, well, what's a tangible example? In redistricting, it comes down to, as a part of fair opportunity maps, there's a notion of cracking or packing. Cracking is just like you crack an egg, you split a group of communities of interest into pieces, right? And so instead of having a group consolidated in a certain area where they might have a better chance of representation, you take that group and you split them off, so that they only comprise, maybe 10% here and 15% there. And so then they never have a real, fair opportunity to have a person elected that represents their community. When you don't have, I tend to stress opportunity districts, because you want it to be where multiple communities are evenly balanced and they have an even chance of having representation. And then it's not about whatever community of interest, it's about who has the best ideas and who's going to do the work. And so I'll say specifically, the last redistricting in 2011, right, in the Texas state legislature, House districts 137 and 149, which basically cover the southwest area here of Sharpstown, Gulfton, Asiatown, Alief. The House wanted to basically pack those two districts together. So packing is where you stick everyone together and you cram them in like a can of sardines. So they tried to pack these two together specifically to prevent there from having the opportunity districts where two Asians would have an opportunity to be able to run and win. Those two opportunity districts are currently held by Representative Hubert Vo and Representative Jean Wu. That was a part of a lawsuit in 2011 to have to reverse that, right? So that's the next piece that would happen if we do not have fair mapping, fair opportunity mapping. And what does fair mean? It really means the inclusion and transparency. What we've all been asking for in Texas is we want, we don't want these maps to be done behind doors. We want an opportunity for these maps to be publicly displayed, for inclusion of communities to have a real opportunity, to give input. So it's not like, oh, we're going to go through the motions, we're going to put the map up and you have one day to look at it. And then we're going to make our decision at 2 o'clock in the morning when everybody's asleep, right? It should be hearings that are equitable, that have translation services like what we have today, where if these hearings allow for communities with immigrants, with limited English proficient people, having the opportunity to speak up and say, this is what we think needs to happen for our community. And we live here. We're the ones who are going to be impacted when decisions are made about how our money gets spent. I'll leave it at that for
all right.
questions.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Chen. Next, we go to Roshan Evans, a co-founder of Pure Justice, who will describe how he defines communities of concern. Please go ahead.
So first, thank you for having me. My name is Roshan C. Evans. I'm the co-founder of the Pure Justice Organization, author of 4 books. My books circle around the criminal justice system and the impacts it have on individuals like myself. I am impacted by the system, and I do understand that, like, the system within the criminal justice system, and just, you know, it need a lot of reform. You know, inside the criminal justice system, outside the criminal justice system, you know, just voicing our opinion, you know, like, everything need to be reformed. And I think, you know, one thing that we have to be mindful of, like, when it comes to like redistricting and drawing maps, that there's a thin line between wants and needs. So we have to be like drawing these maps. It's a tough job, you know, because everybody want to carve the map out in a certain fashion that would, you know, where they will be the beneficiaries of the votes or the voice of the people. When, you know, to echo Debbie, you know, like, we really need to have inclusion, and they really need to be equitable. So it's like, how do you do that? And the way you do that, I believe, and I know it's so many different opinions when it comes to drawing the maps, because everybody have their own idea, but you have to keep, you know, like, people with the same concerns, the same needs together instead of the same wants. So that's digging into, you know, particular monuments everybody like to go and take pictures in front of, or, you know, where kids go to the same school, where people go to church, you know, keep people who shop together in the same area. And I believe once our neighborhoods start getting gentrified, you know, and that gentrification began to pull away from the schools and the grocery stores, and, you know, their kids is no longer playing at the same parks, that need to begin to start getting carved out. So one of the initiatives that Pure Justice have been involved in, of course, over the years, we stay involved in voter engagement. We also worked in a census to maximize the number of people that actually fill out the census, because we want to make sure the proper neighborhoods get the proper funding, and, you know, we want to make sure everybody is counted, you know. But, like, we are also outlining maps, you know, and drawing the maps. Somebody asked the question, who draws the maps? You know, as of now, at the top of the political food chain, the Republicans run everything. But we can actually make suggestive maps, and you can draw them out on districtr.com. And there's trainings for that. So within the Pure Justice Organization, I don't know everything about every community, but I do know where we focus and target, you know, our organizing, and where we work with individuals, which is like in 5th Ward and 3rd Ward, and, you know, Sunnyside. And we have people who've been, you know, like natives of their community since they've been born, you know, and these are the people that we pull to the forefront to carve out the way they see their neighborhood, and to give a replica of how they think that their neighborhood should look. I mean, so redistricting is based on the idea of one person, one vote, which makes sure each of our voices is represented fairly by creating districts that have like the same number of people. But of course, we'll never create or carve out maps of areas where it's an equal number of people from zone to zone. But we certainly need to make a point to keep people together who got like the same common problems, you know, flooding issues, you know. So I just want to emphasize that voting, it really matters, you know, like our voices and opinions really matter. And if you're not involved in, you know, like voter engagement, or like we only do the maps every 10 years. Many of you already know, but if you're not involved, or if you know your community, get involved and try to figure out how to carve out a map, you know, from your area, your neighborhood, because, you know, it's important that, you know, we could bring equity to our elections. And that's pretty much all I have.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Mr. Evans. Our next speaker is Miguel Rivera of the Texas Civil Rights Project, and he will talk about something that you know, many of us in the media have faced when we try to explain things that get lost in translation when you try to explain to Spanish speakers what redistricting is. Sometimes it isn't as easy as you think. Miguel, please go ahead.
Thank you, and sorry, I'm having some connectivity issues, so hopefully you all can hear me well. Thank you for having me. My name is Miguel Rivera. I am with the Texas Civil Rights Project, and I do a lot of our community organizing around redistricting. Pilar, I think I naturally speak fast, so if I go a bit too fast, please let me know.
Yes, you seem to do it. Yes.
But I think I essentially wanted to talk a bit about redistricting, gerrymandering, and how it translates into Spanish particularly, and the challenge that this poses when organizing Spanish-speaking communities. And so basically, I think in the description for what I wanted to talk about, I say that there's no word for redistricting. There are a few phrases used to talk about redistricting in Spanish, but there is no Spanish equivalent to the term gerrymandering. And I first came upon this conundrum or challenge when trying to explain to my parents what I did for a living. And to give some context, my parents and I were all born in rural Mexico. I came at a very young age at 2 years old. My parents were in their 20s, but they had all of their education and their political education done in Mexico. So when I began working on community organizing around redistricting, I realized that I didn't have the specific nomenclature to fully get across the message on what redistricting and gerrymandering were, and the work that we were trying to do to make sure that there was justice when the lines were drawn. That being said, there are processes that they did understand. Within voting rights, they understood the fight for voting rights, and those had a lot of translatable terms. Within some of our border and immigrant justice work, we also had equivalent terms in Spanish. But their understanding of the census and redistricting is a lot different than how it occurs in the US. And I realized that I really had to find out which terms worked best to get the best message across. So right now, to define redistricting in Spanish, there's a few phrases that are used to really talk about the process. There's the first one, which I think is more prevalently used, redistribución de distritos electorales, translated into English as the redistribution of electoral districts. And there's also rediseño de distritos electorales, or the redesign of electoral districts. Now, the first one is more widely used, redistribución, but for some, including my parents, they took this term to mean more reapportionment, the districts being redistributed amongst the states and getting their certain amount of representation at the federal level. Rediseño for them helped understand that the lines were going to be drawn and that they were subject to change as a result of the new census. So one of the projects that TCRP is trying to lead right now is basically unifying the message of, or unifying some terms and making sure that for educational purposes and educational campaigns, we can coalesce behind a specific term and move that forward as a term that we are going to use when trying to educate on redistricting to the Spanish-speaking community. I also want to recognize that this is not a language specific, or this is not an issue specific to Spanish speakers in Texas. I presume that this is a challenge that is faced in many non-English speaking communities within the state of Texas. And so this requires a specific nuance and understanding of the communities on the ground to know which terms are most effective in order to get the message across and allow people to participate in this process as it's about to take place. But that's essentially what I wanted to talk about and some of the issues that we've highlighted and hope to move forward within the next few weeks.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Thank you. Now we're going to go to our fourth speaker, and then we'll have questions. Our speaker is Cassandra Martinez of Mi Familia Vota, who represents Generation Z. She's just graduated and is about to enter Columbia University in New York City to study mechanical engineering. Why do you care about redistricting? And how do you get other young people who may be indifferent to politics to care? Cassandra, please go ahead.
Hello. First, I just wanted to say thank you for giving me this platform and say thank you to everyone who organized this event. My interest in activism and politics and redistricting started way long before I actually became an active activist in this community. But my first interaction with actually participating in this community was going to a workshop in 2019 with Mi Familia Vota, where I was first exposed to exactly what the census meant and how it impacted our local communities. So in going to these workshops, I found out that young people and people of my ethnic background, Hispanic people, oftentimes don't know the specific details behind what goes behind redistricting and census counting, but there is a care in the community. So for example, people might care about income inequality. They might care about the schools their children go to, and they might care about the construction projects that never quite get done in our communities, but they don't exactly make the connection between census counting and redistricting and all the reasons why our communities are the way they are. So in my work, I did phone banks and text banks and just general youth outreach in my personal life. And I found the most difficult barrier to overcome was apathy in the community. And the first time I truly saw this apathy face to face was with one of my childhood friends. We had gone to the same schools, grown up in the same block of apartments, and gone to the same schools. But I found that whenever he saw activist movements, he saw just futile attempts to fix a system that will never be truly fixed by individual actions, while I saw an opportunity to grow. And oftentimes when you speak to these kind of people who kind of don't see any hope in these activist movements, he saw no point in filling out the census. He saw no point in registering to vote because there's this whole mentality of my vote doesn't matter, my count won't matter, my family won't matter in the grand scheme of things. And I found whenever I showed him articles or arguments of the series of events that lead to these kinds of community, lack of resources in our community, there wasn't a connect between what he saw in person and what he saw in the news. And I found that what actually helped people like him and just general people in my age group to care was to think about their families and the future of their communities. So in this specific case, I pointed out that his younger sister, she's around 3 years old now, would have to go to the same underfunded schools that we went to and have to face the same problems that we face in going to those same schools. And just to give you some context, the schools we went to growing up, they did not have any extracurricular clubs. They didn't have any advanced classes for students. They had no sports teams, and they didn't even have a patch of grass to call their own. And then you turn around and see all these big schools in more funded areas that had entire volleyball fields, football stadiums to their name. And then you look at the community we grew up in and we're like, wait, where were all these resources when we needed them? So in order to fix this problem for future generations, you have to think about what exactly are the problems that account for this income disparity that our children and we had to face. So the matter of redistricting specifically impacts the school board, the Texas Board of Education. So we see HISD has recently had so many big changes, a new superintendent, brand new board of trustees. And this organization is what is an opportunity for us to be able to go in and change these matters in order to put in people that actually represent lower income areas that have long been ignored for the entirety of the time I've been in school. So when we talk about redistricting, we have to kind of appeal to the things that they care about. If we talk about, this certain law won't pass, or this arbitrary part of Congress will change, people don't really hear the change in that. But when we talk about like, oh, these are the districts that you will be voting in for the next 10 years, then we see a kind of change in their thinking. This is your chance to vote out all those politicians who you don't care for, that you don't see yourself represented in. So when we talk about redistricting, we have to kind of talk about it in more specific terms in order to get people to understand, in order to get people to care. And talking specifically about the Hispanic community, it's oftentimes difficult to talk about because a lot of us coming from immigrant households, we don't have the kind of generational knowledge that a lot of other ethnic groups have. A lot of our parents weren't exactly activists in their own countries. So when they come here, they kind of feel a disconnect from the politics because, for example, most immigrants pay taxes, yet we don't get the same kind of funding. When the first few stimulus checks were coming out, a lot of immigrants that pay taxes and that fulfill their duties as people who lived in America did not receive those benefits. So it's this kind of disillusionment that causes people to not want to put in their voice. So in order to get people to care, you have to be a lot more realistic, and you have to go out and target these specific local communities in order to get people to see what the future is in redistricting. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cassandra. That was great. I want to go back to Debbie. We have several partners from Texas, from the Asian API community. So we want to go back to the issue of how does the redistricting in Texas affect the Asian communities? And what is the risk for those communities? If you can address that a little bit more, Debbie.
Well, the risk is that we get, either packed or we get cracked, right? Where, the Asian community is growing, and there are certain areas that we tend to be concentrated in, but we're not, in such numbers that we can just directly say, oh, let's have a majority Asian American district. Like that just doesn't exist yet, right? So for us, it's really important to have opportunity districts where there's at least a significant enough number of us in a district where we can actually, have an opportunity to have a representative. So those are some of the risks. So when you talk about, packing, right? Let's just say hypothetically, there's, potentially an area where there's, 25%, Asian. So theoretically, that could be a group, a community of interests where they're all immigrants of a certain demographic, and they're all put in one district where they might have an opportunity to have a representative. Or you could take that same group and split it across, 2 or 3. And so then each of those, 2 or 3 different districts would then have maybe 8% or 7% or 9%, where it would be much harder for a candidate to at least have a base, right, to work from, and then to spend time and energy to try and convince other people in the district to say, hey, these are my ideas for our people who live in our district, please, consider me as someone to represent us, right? That's just one example.
Great. I wanted to ask a similar question to Roshan. How do you see the African-American communities in this situation in Texas? What is the risk for those communities? Because oftentimes you see African-Americans in the same districts with Latinos, for example. So there's there's an issue there, is there?
Yeah, actually, I think when it comes to African Americans, we are a little broken when it comes to voting in elections because we don't think our voices and vote matter. I mean, we've been doing a good job pulling people out to vote. I mean, people been voting like the older, the more seasoned generation. They've been coming out. It's the younger. We got some work to do. We got work to do.
Okay. So Nina, I think Nina had to go. Do you have 2 minutes, Nina? 2 minutes? If you're still here, how is the fight for voter access going to affect redistricting? If you can answer that in a minute before you have to jump off the call. She probably already jumped off. She had another presentation right at the top of the hour, Sandy, so I think she left. Yes, I think she left. Anyone has thoughts about this? How will the whole fight over voter rights and potential efforts to curtail voters' rights play with the redistricting issue? Anyone? Maybe Miguel?
I can try to answer the question. And I think I would just try to start off by saying that voting rights and redistricting essentially go hand in hand. You have voting happens within your electoral districts. Your electoral districts affect who you vote for. And so they go hand in hand, and voter suppression and gerrymandering have both been methods where elected officials have used them and weaponized them to maintain political power. And so access to the ballot box is just as important as fair redistricting. And I think if we see, and this is just kind of, I guess, like me thinking about what the landscape looks like in Texas, but if we see very aggressive attacks on access to the ballot and voting rights, we can expect the same aggression come redistricting this fall when the maps are actually being drawn.
Okay. Thank you so much. There's a question here from Peter. Can someone talk about nonpartisan commissions versus party-controlled? I think in California, it used to be the legislature, so it would be controlled by whoever was in the majority. Now it's a citizen commission, but it's always a challenge to get representation from the groups, the minority groups. Anyone want to take that on? What's the difference between having politicians doing it and having another type of commission doing it? Anyone can make comments about that?
Well, ultimately, it comes down to, are they going to look beyond their self-interest, right? Anyone who's a politician who's in place, they have an inherent, interest in wanting to make sure that there's the status quo, and not, have, because there's a risk with change, right? Versus looking at, what's in the best interest of the people who live in this area. And taking on a little bit of risk. It's not to say that a district would change so much that they would automatically not be able to run again, right? But certainly it will take some effort. And so there's always the risk that people will not look beyond their own self-interest. And so having bipartisan or independent commissions with input from the community, absolutely tries to go beyond self-interest.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. My last question to all of you still present in the call is, what is the story you want us at Nick Media to write? Well, let's start with you, Debbie.
First and foremost is everybody should go out and register to vote, and be sure to vote, right? So that our communities are taken seriously. That's the first step. A lot of times we're considered invisible because our people don't vote. And so because we don't, we're perceived as not voting as much, then our concerns are not, taken into account as much. The second is to, demand accountability to, from any of the district, changing, bodies, right? Demand accountability, that it is equitable and it is fair and it's transparent, that all communities have a realistic, opportunity to, testify and to be able to see those maps before they go and make decisions, so that there's real opportunity for community input. And third is, be on the lookout for when they make those hearings available, then we need to go and actually show up and testify, right? Because otherwise we give them the excuse of saying, well, we did this and then no one showed up to testify. So what was
Right.
the point of us going through this effort to make it, available? So, we need to be really mindful of, like, once we demand that accountability, we need to hold them to it and actually show up.
Thank you. Roshan Evans, you were saying that we still have a lot of work to do. What do you want us reporters to talk about in this fight to help you?
So the things that I wish to see or talked about are the things that we know need to be improved, the things that need to be worked on, and what I want actually emphasize, because like we sitting here right now, we talking about redistricting, we talking about drawing new maps, everybody not aware, so if we could just, just keep talking about, like fair elections and what it takes to create the fair elections and, holding people feet to the fire and, just making sure that that we are holding people accountable, like Debbie just said, because if we're not holding people accountable, it's like they're gonna run all over us and do whatever they want to do, and our voice may not be as loud as it could be because we're not actually emphasizing, how important it is that our votes should count. So I would like everything that's going on right now, just continuously emphasize, just pushed up to the forefront. So everybody know, like, look, this is the time is right now. If you're not involved, get involved. Here's how.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. And Miguel Rivera, would you like to add something? What do you want us to talk about in the media? Maybe he left. Okay. He may have left the call. Okay, Cassandra, are you still with us?
Yes.
Please
So
go ahead.
I kind of want to talk about the concern of undocumented immigrants in this conversation, because a lot of times the answer to getting our voices heard is voting and going out and being active politically. But for people who don't have that special little 9-digit number, it's often difficult to get involved in these politics, especially since a lot of the resources that a lot of typical Americans are eligible for aren't available to us. So we feel erased and not prioritized in these conversations. So in order to involve this hidden minority in politics, we have to kind of reach out to them and make a special focus in order to see their concerns and involve them in our legislatures and our community projects, and not just listen to people who have the ability to go out and vote and meet their Congress people and stuff. And I think that outreach was especially important in the census, because that was one of those community projects where you didn't need to be a citizen in order to be counted. And now that we have these 2 new congressional seats in Texas, it's important to notice that a lot of that population, that extra population that helped us get that representation, was due to these immigrants that might not have the voice to go out and vote for those 2 extra seats. So I think it's important to kind of keep them in mind when making these districts, and keep them in mind when we further our political agendas.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. And I appreciate everyone being here to talk about this subject. And thank you for illuminating it for our media organizations. And that's it. It's a wrap.